when we stopped seeing each other. Have you ever felt invisible while standing right next to the person you love the most? This video is not about perfect English or perfect marriage. It is about the quiet moments when love doesn't explode, it slowly fades. In the next 20 minutes, I'll tell you a real story from my life in the United States, about marriage, kids, exhaustion, and one simple date that changed everything. If you're tired, discouraged, or quietly giving up, on English or on love, stay with me. There was no big fight. No slam doors. No dramatic words. That's the scary part. One evening, I was washing dishes while my partner scrolled on the phone, and our kids argued in the background about a missing toy. Suddenly, a strange thought hit me. We are all here, but no one is really here. Not angry. Not sad. Just unseen. You know that feeling? When your body is present, but your mind is somewhere else. When conversations turn into logistics. Did you pay the bill? Who's picking up the kids? What's for dinner? Marriage, at that moment, felt like a shared calendar, not a shared life. 3 weeks ago, living in the US, everything looked fine. That's a dangerous word. Fine means nothing is broken enough to fix. We had a home. We had healthy kids. We had jobs. But emotionally, we were surviving, not connecting. And the worst part? We both thought it was normal. Psychologists call this emotional neglect, but I didn't need a textbook to feel it. I felt it when I spoke and didn't finish my sentence because I already knew no one was really listening. I felt it when my partner answered with aha, without lifting their eyes. Being unseen doesn't hurt loudly. It hurts quietly, like a slow leak in a tire. You don't notice until you can't move forward anymore. And here's something interesting. When you feel unseen at home, your motivation collapses everywhere else too. Even learning English. Especially learning English. I would sit down to practice, press play on a listening video, and my brain would say, not now. Not because English was hard, but because my emotional tank was empty. Science backs this up. When you feel emotionally disconnected, your brain goes into energy-saving mode. It reduces focus, curiosity, and effort. Your nervous system isn't lazy, it's overwhelmed. So if you've ever blamed yourself for losing discipline, maybe it wasn't discipline at all. Maybe you just needed to feel seen. At that time, my English practice became background noise. Words passed through my ears without landing. I could hear, but I wasn't present. Kind of like my marriage. One night, after the kids finally fell asleep, my partner asked, "Are you okay?" I almost said yes. That's the automatic answer. The safe answer. Instead, I paused. And said very softly, "I don't think we see each other anymore." Silence. Not the awkward kind. The heavy kind. That moment wasn't a breakthrough yet. It was just awareness. But awareness is powerful. In psychology, awareness is the first crack where change can enter. You can't fix what you refuse to name. If you're listening right now, maybe you recognize this story. Maybe your relationship feels distant. Maybe your English feels stuck. Maybe you're telling yourself you're just tired. And maybe you are. But sometimes, tiredness is just loneliness wearing a practical outfit. This story isn't about blame. It's about noticing. About asking the question before everything breaks. When did we stop seeing each other? And that question, quiet, uncomfortable, honest, is where everything began to change. Life looked fine from outside. From the outside, our life looked respectable. That's the word people use when nothing seems wrong enough to worry about. We lived in a quiet American neighborhood where lawns were trimmed and trash cans appeared like clockwork every Tuesday morning. Our kids waved at the school bus. Neighbors smiled politely. If you took a photo, it would scream stability. But photos lie. Inside the house, time felt compressed. Mornings were loud and rushed. Shoes missing. Lunch boxes half-packed. Someone always asking a question while you're already late. By the time the front door closed, my heart was already tired. Not broken, just worn thin, like a towel used too many times. At night, the exhaustion changed shape. We sat on the same couch, watched the same shows, laughed at the same jokes. But we weren't together. We were parallel lines, close, familiar, never touching. If someone asked how our marriage was, I would have said, good. Not because it was true, but because I didn't have a better word that fit into small talk. That's the trick of modern family life in the US. It rewards function, not feeling. As long as the kids are fed, bills are paid, and nobody is yelling, everything gets labeled as working. But something can work and still be empty. Like a phone with great signal and 5% battery. Researchers talk about something called role overload. When you're a parent, partner, worker, planner, fixer, and emotional shock absorber, all before noon, your identity slowly dissolves into tasks. You stop asking, how do I feel? And start asking, what's next? Love doesn't disappear. It just gets buried under responsibility. And here's where it gets sneaky. Because nothing is on fire, you don't call for help. Because no one is cheating or leaving, you don't feel allowed to be unhappy. Gratitude turns into guilt. You think, other people have it worse. Why am I complaining? So you don't. You swallow it. That swallowing shows up in strange ways. Short answers. Long silences. You forget what you used to talk about before life became a group project. And slowly, without realizing it, you stop sharing your inner world. Not out of anger, but out of habit. This was exactly when my English learning started to slide. I'd open a notebook, stare at a simple sentence, and feel oddly annoyed. Not at the words, but at myself. My brain was too full of unfinished emotions to make room for a new language. Cognitive psychology explains this simply: your working memory has limits. Emotional stress takes up space. When that space is crowded, learning feels impossible. That's why motivation advice often fails. You don't need more discipline. You need less emotional noise. I remember thinking, if I can't even focus on English, what's wrong with me? Nothing was wrong. Something was missing. One evening, while folding laundry, I noticed how quiet the house felt. Not peaceful. Empty. The kids were busy. My partner was busy. And I was busy pretending that fine was enough. That's when it hit me. We had built a life that functioned perfectly. For everyone else. The outside world saw success. Inside, we felt postponed. Like we were waiting for a future moment when things would slow down and connection would magically return. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Life doesn't give connection back by default. You have to choose it. Actively. Awkwardly. Sometimes clumsily. If you're listening and nodding, let me say this clearly. There's nothing weak about wanting more than fine. Wanting to be seen doesn't mean you're ungrateful. It means you're human. And the moment you admit that the outside doesn't match the inside, you create the first opening. Not for drama. Not for blame. But for honesty. Because once you stop pretending everything is okay, you finally give yourself permission to ask a better question. What are we actually missing? That question lingered with us. Quietly. Uncomfortably. And it set the stage for everything that followed. The quiet distance between us. Distance doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it tiptoes in, takes off its shoes, and sits between two people like it belongs there. That was us. No arguments. No dramatic confessions. Just a growing space filled with things we didn't say because saying them felt unnecessary. Or worse, exhausting. Imagine two people rowing the same boat, facing forward, never looking at each other. Technically, you're together. Emotionally, you're alone. Our days revolved around our kids. Their schedules became the rhythm of our lives. School drop-offs, homework battles, bedtime negotiations that felt like diplomatic missions. By the time the house went quiet, we had nothing left. Not energy. Not curiosity. Not even complaints. Silence felt easier than conversation. Psychologists call this emotional withdrawal. It's not a decision, it's a defense. When your brain associates interaction with effort or disappointment, it chooses distance as a form of rest. Your nervous system isn't being cold, it's being efficient. Unfortunately, efficiency is terrible for intimacy. The distance showed up in tiny ways. I stopped sharing random thoughts. My partner stopped asking follow-up questions. We exchanged information, not feelings. Our conversations sounded like emails, clear, polite, and completely lifeless. What hurt most wasn't what was missing. It was how normal it felt. Humans adapt frighteningly fast. Even loneliness can become familiar if it's predictable. That's why people stay stuck. Not because they don't care, but because the distance doesn't scream. It whispers. And here's something no one tells you. distance grows fastest when both people are trying to be strong. We didn't want to add stress to each other's lives. So we minimized ourselves. We edited our emotions. We thought we were being kind. In reality, we were disappearing. This is also when resentment quietly forms. Not explosive resentment, subtle resentment. The kind that shows up as sarcasm, or forgetting to do small favors, or thinking, they should know how I feel. But minds don't read feelings. They read patterns. And our pattern was absence. I noticed the distance most clearly one Sunday morning. We were all at the breakfast table. Kids talking over each other. Cereal spilling. Normal chaos. And I realized I didn't know what my partner had been thinking about lately. Not dreams. Not worries. Just thoughts. We lived in the same house, but our inner worlds had stopped overlapping. Neuroscience explains this with something called attunement. Close relationships stay healthy when people regularly tune into each other's emotional signals. Tone, timing, curiosity. When attunement drops, connection weakens. Not because love is gone, but because attention has shifted elsewhere. This lack of attunement affects everything, including learning. When your emotional bonds feel unstable, your brain prioritizes safety over growth. New skills, like speaking English, feel risky. You hesitate. You overthink. You avoid sounding foolish. That's not laziness. That's self-protection. I remember trying to read a short English paragraph out loud and stopping halfway through. My voice sounded flat. Not because I couldn't pronounce the words, but because I didn't feel engaged with anything, including myself. It's hard to practice expression when you feel emotionally muted. Distance doesn't mean you don't love each other. Sometimes it means you love each other so much that you forgot to stay curious. You stopped asking, "Who are you becoming?" and settled for "We're managing." But managing is not living. And managing doesn't heal distance, it maintains it. That realization didn't lead to an immediate fix. It led to discomfort. Awareness always does. Once you see the gap, you can't unsee it. And suddenly, the silence between you feels louder than any argument ever could. That was where we stood. Two tired adults. Loving parents. Capable partners. And strangers in the quiet moments. But distance, once noticed, loses its power. Because what it fears most is attention. And attention, real attention, was coming next. Why small things start hurting. It's strange how a forgotten text or an unwashed cup can hurt more than big arguments ever did. One day, I found myself irritated by the way my partner sighed when sitting down. Not a loud sigh. Just a breath. And somehow, it landed like an accusation. That's when I knew something deeper was going on. When connection weakens, small things stop being small. Psychology explains this with a concept called emotional bandwidth. When your emotional needs are met, your brain has room for patience, humor, and flexibility. But when those needs go unmet, your tolerance shrinks. Tiny frustrations feel personal. Neutral moments feel cold. Your mind starts asking, why don't they care? Even when no harm was intended. In our home, the small things became signals. A delayed reply felt like rejection. A distracted "okay" sounded like dismissal. We weren't reacting to the moment, we were reacting to the history behind it. Every minor slip added evidence to a story we were quietly writing. I don't matter as much as I used to. That story is powerful. And dangerous. Neuroscience shows that the brain is a prediction machine. It constantly guesses what will happen next based on past experiences. Once your brain predicts emotional neglect, it becomes hyper-alert. It scans for proof. And proof is easy to find when you're already tired. That's why I'd rehearse conversations in my head. Imaginary arguments. Imaginary explanations. I'd feel upset before anything even happened. By the time my partner spoke, my nervous system was already tense. I wasn't listening, I was defending. This is where many relationships get stuck. Not because of a lack of love, but because both people are living in protective mode. Protect your time. Protect your energy. Protect your heart. Unfortunately, protection looks a lot like distance from the outside. The same pattern showed up when I tried to practice English. I'd make one small mistake and feel an outsized wave of frustration. My inner voice got sharp. You should know this by now. That voice wasn't about grammar. It was about self-worth. When you feel unseen, mistakes feel like confirmation that you're failing at everything. Cognitive behavioral research shows that emotional stress increases negative self-talk. The brain becomes less forgiving. Learning slows down not because the content is harder, but because your mind is harsher. Every error feels expensive. One night, after a particularly quiet dinner, I snapped over something trivial. Immediately, regret followed. The reaction didn't match the situation. That mismatch is a signal. When emotions overflow in the wrong places, it means they're not being released in the right ones. Here's the key insight we often miss. Small things hurt when big needs go unmet. Attention. Appreciation. Being known. These needs don't disappear just because you're an adult. They don't retire after marriage or kids. They just stop asking loudly. Instead, they leak out sideways. Studies in relationship psychology show that couples who feel emotionally validated recover faster from conflict. Validation doesn't mean agreement. It means acknowledgement. A simple "I see you" can regulate the nervous system more effectively than any logical explanation. At that point, we weren't validating each other. We were correcting each other. Fixing. Explaining. Moving on. All practical. All efficient. And emotionally useless. Understanding this changed the way I looked at our tension. It wasn't about chores or tone or timing. It was about visibility. About whether our inner experiences still mattered to each other. Once you see that, blame loses its appeal. Curiosity becomes more useful. Instead of asking, "Why are you like this?" a better question appears. What need is going unmet right now? That question doesn't solve everything, but it softens the edges. It creates space. And space is where reconnection can begin. Small things hurt less when big things are held with care. And at that moment, we were finally close to understanding what those big things were. English became background noise. There's a strange moment when sound turns into fog. You can hear it technically, but nothing sticks. That's what English became for me. Videos played. Words flowed. Sentences rose and fell like waves. And my brain? It nodded politely and remembered nothing. At first, I blamed discipline. Maybe I wasn't trying hard enough. Maybe I needed a better schedule, a stricter routine, a louder motivation speech in my head. That's the lie we love to tell ourselves. If something isn't working, we must need more force. But force doesn't work on a tired nervous system. When emotional weight piles up, your brain quietly shifts priorities. Survival first. Learning later. Neuroscience calls this cognitive load. Your mind can only hold so much at one time. When relationships feel unstable or distant, they consume that space. Not consciously. Automatically. So when I sat down to practice English, my attention slipped away. I'd rewind the same sentence 3 times and still miss it. Not because it was difficult, but because my thoughts were elsewhere. On conversations we didn't have. On feelings we postponed. On that invisible gap sitting between 2 people who once knew each other deeply. English didn't fail me. My capacity did. This is important if you're learning right now. If you've ever thought, "Why can't I focus anymore? I used to do better than this," listen closely. Focus is not a moral skill. It's an emotional state. When your inner world feels unsettled, your brain protects itself by tuning out anything non-essential. That's why English turned into background noise. It wasn't urgent. It wasn't comforting. It didn't promise relief. So my brain said, later. Psychological studies show that language learning requires emotional safety. You need to risk sounding wrong. You need to tolerate confusion. When you don't feel seen in your personal life, that tolerance collapses. Mistakes feel heavier. Silence feels safer than speaking. I remember opening my mouth to repeat a simple sentence, something basic, like, "I've been feeling overwhelmed lately." The irony didn't escape me. I stopped halfway through. My throat felt tight. It wasn't about pronunciation. It was about honesty. When you don't feel heard at home, practicing expression feels pointless. Why train your voice if it doesn't land anywhere? This is why many adults quit. Not because they're incapable, but because their emotional environment doesn't support learning. Motivation advice ignores this completely. It tells you to push harder, wake up earlier, be more disciplined. Meanwhile, your nervous system is whispering, "I'm already full." Here's the shift that changed everything for me. I stopped asking, how do I force myself to learn English? And started asking, what is draining my energy before I even begin? That question led me back to my relationship, to the quiet distance, to the feeling of being unseen. Once I named it, the fog lifted slightly. Not magically, but enough to notice that English wasn't the enemy. It was the mirror. Language is connection. It's how we make meaning together. When connection is missing in your life, learning language feels hollow. But when connection returns, even a little, words come back to life. So if English feels like noise right now, don't panic. Don't judge yourself. Check your emotional volume. What's already playing loudly inside you? Because you don't need more motivation. You need alignment. A sense that your voice matters somewhere. And when that begins to return, even slowly, English stops being background noise. It becomes a bridge again. 3 weeks that changed everything. 3 weeks can feel insignificant on a calendar. Just a few squares you flip past without thinking. But emotionally, 3 weeks can stretch into something heavy enough to crack you open. That's what happened to us. Not all at once. Slowly. Relentlessly. Like pressure building where no one is looking. Those weeks were busy in the most ordinary way. School projects. Work deadlines. Grocery lists that never got shorter. On the surface, nothing dramatic happened. But inside the house, tension started to hum. Not loud enough to argue about. Loud enough to feel. The strange part was how tired we both became. Tired beyond sleep. You know that kind of tired. You rest, but nothing resets. Your body is fine, but your patience is gone. Your voice gets flatter. Your reactions get sharper. You start responding instead of connecting. During those 3 weeks, we barely touched emotionally. We coordinated like co-workers. Efficient. Polite. Distant. Our kids didn't notice anything wrong, which somehow made it worse. It meant we were good at hiding. Too good. Psychology has a term for this phase: emotional accumulation. When unresolved feelings stack up without release, they don't disappear. They compress. Eventually, something small triggers something big, not because of the trigger, but because the storage is full. I noticed it in my body first. Tight shoulders. Shallow breathing. A constant sense of urgency with nowhere to go. My nervous system stayed slightly activated all day, like a phone that never fully locks its screen. That state drains energy faster than any physical work. And once again, English suffered. I tried to keep my routine. 10 minutes of listening. 5 minutes of speaking. Simple. But my mind resisted. Words felt heavy. Even familiar phrases felt distant. Learning requires curiosity, and curiosity dies quickly under pressure. There's research showing that chronic stress reduces activity in the prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for focus, planning, and language processing. Translation: When life feels emotionally unstable, your brain literally has fewer resources for learning. It's not personal. It's biological. One evening during that third week, everything felt unbearably quiet. The kids were asleep. The house was clean. The kind of moment that should feel peaceful. Instead, it felt like standing in an empty airport after midnight, too still, too hollow. I realized then that we were both waiting for something to break the tension. A fight. A confession. A moment big enough to justify stopping and talking. But nothing came. And that waiting was its own kind of suffering. Here's what no one tells you. Many relationships don't fail from explosion. They fade from postponement. From waiting for the right time to reconnect. From believing that once things calm down, closeness will return automatically. Those 3 weeks forced a different realization. Calm doesn't create connection. Attention does. That insight hurt, because it meant responsibility. It meant admitting that staying silent was also a choice. A protective choice, but still a choice. Around that time, I stopped trying to push through my English practice. Instead, I listened passively while doing chores. No pressure. No goals. Just sound. And something interesting happened. I started noticing emotional phrases more than technical ones. Words about feeling. About being tired. About wanting to be understood. Language reflects what you're ready to hear. Those 3 weeks weren't the breaking point. They were the clarification point. The moment when avoidance stopped working. When pretending everything was fine became more exhausting than admitting it wasn't. By the end of that period, one thing was clear. Something had to change. Not dramatically. Not publicly. But intentionally. And that intention, small, awkward, uncertain, led directly to one simple decision that would shift everything. Not a solution yet, but a step. One simple date, no big plan. The decision didn't arrive with confidence. It arrived with hesitation. Not excitement, resistance. I almost talked myself out of it. Because when distance grows, even closeness feels risky. You worry it will expose how far apart you really are. The idea was embarrassingly small. A simple date. No babysitter drama. No expensive restaurant. No grand speech prepared in advance. Just time. Intentionally spent. Together. That was it. We chose a weekday evening. Early. Practical. The kind of choice people make when they don't trust hope too much. We picked a quiet place nearby. Nothing fancy, nothing loud. Somewhere we could hear each other breathe. And here's the strange part. Walking in felt awkward. Like meeting someone you used to know very well, but haven't spoken to in years. Familiar face. Unfamiliar energy. We sat down and smiled politely. Not fake. Just careful. Our brains were on alert. Neuroscience explains why. When emotional distance exists, your nervous system expects threat, even in safe situations. It scans tone, posture, pauses. It prepares you to defend or withdraw. That's why the beginning felt stiff. Not because we didn't care, but because we cared too much. We didn't start with deep questions. No, where are we going? No, what's wrong with us? We started with neutral territory. The kids. Work. Something funny that happened that day. On the surface, it sounded like more of the same. But something was different. There was eye contact. That alone changes chemistry. Research shows that sustained eye contact increases oxytocin, the bonding hormone. It's not romantic nonsense. It's biology. When you look at someone and feel seen, your body softens before your mind does. I noticed my shoulders drop. My breathing slow. My sentences lengthen. Instead of quick updates, I started telling small stories. Not important ones. Honest ones. At one point, my partner said something ordinary, and then paused, and added, "That sounds exhausting." Not advice. Not a solution. Just acknowledgement. That sentence landed harder than any apology ever could. Being seen isn't about agreement. It's about recognition. About having your inner experience reflected back to you without correction. Psychology calls this emotional validation. The nervous system hears it as safety. Once safety appeared, words followed. I shared how invisible I'd been feeling. Quietly. Without accusation. And something unexpected happened. My partner didn't defend. Didn't explain. Just listened. Fully. That kind of listening is rare because it costs attention. And attention is the most valuable currency we have. The date stayed simple. No dramatic turning point. No sudden resolution. But there was laughter. Real laughter. The kind that surprises you because you forgot it lived there. What saved us wasn't the date itself. It was the signal it sent. You still matter enough to choose. That's powerful. Studies in relationship psychology show that intentional time, even short, low-pressure time, restores emotional connection more effectively than problem-solving conversations. Why? Because connection comes before correction. I realized something else too. My English, which had felt heavy for weeks, suddenly felt lighter that night. On the drive home, I repeated a sentence from earlier in my head. Not to practice. Just because it felt good to hear my own voice again. When you feel seen, expression returns naturally. The date didn't fix everything. It didn't erase the past weeks. But it interrupted the pattern. And interruption is how change begins. You don't need a perfect plan. You need a different move. That evening taught me this. When distance grows, don't wait for motivation. Choose presence. Motivation follows. One simple date didn't solve our problems. But it reminded us we were still on the same side of the table. And that reminder was enough to reopen the door we thought had quietly closed. The moment I felt seen again. The moment didn't look dramatic. No tears. No long speech. No movie-style silence filled with meaning. It arrived quietly, disguised as something ordinary. And that's why it almost slipped past unnoticed. We were still sitting there, halfway through the evening, when my partner leaned forward slightly and asked, "What's been the hardest part for you lately?" Not what's wrong. Not what should we fix. Just, hardest. My first instinct was to minimize. To give a short answer. To keep things light. Years of practice had trained me well. But something about the tone, steady, open, disarmed me. I paused. That pause mattered. When you feel safe, your body pauses before your mind edits. I spoke slowly. Not carefully. Slowly. Words came out uneven, imperfect, honest. I talked about feeling replaceable. About how days blurred together. About missing the version of myself that felt curious and alive. I wasn't performing vulnerability. I was describing my internal weather. And then something subtle happened. My partner didn't interrupt. Didn't reframe. Didn't reassure too quickly. They stayed present. Their face reflected understanding before their mouth did. That reflection, that mirroring, is what psychologists call being seen. It's when someone recognizes your inner state without trying to improve it. The effect is immediate. Your nervous system shifts from defense to regulation. Heart rate lowers. Muscles soften. Your voice steadies. You don't need to push your feelings away anymore because someone else is holding them with you. In that moment, I felt real again. Being seen doesn't inflate the ego. It grounds it. You stop wondering if you're too much or not enough. You simply exist, and that's enough. What surprised me most was how physical the experience was. Warmth in my chest. A sense of space in my head. I didn't feel fixed. I felt recognized. And recognition is often more healing than solutions. Neuroscience explains why. When you feel emotionally attuned to someone, your brain releases oxytocin and reduces cortisol. Stress drops. Trust rises. You don't think your way into safety, you feel your way there. That feeling followed me home. Later that night, after the house went quiet, I tried reading a short English paragraph out loud. No plan. No goal. Just curiosity. My voice sounded different. More present. Less rushed. The words landed. Language thrives in safety. This is why children learn faster when they feel emotionally secure. And why adults struggle when they don't. Learning isn't just about input, it's about permission. Permission to try. Permission to sound imperfect. Permission to be visible. Feeling seen gave me that permission back. It also changed how I looked at my partner. I realized they had been unseen too. Their quiet wasn't indifference, it was fatigue. Their distance wasn't rejection, it was protection. Once you feel seen, it becomes easier to see others. This moment didn't erase our problems, but it reset the emotional tone. from guarded to open, from managing to connecting. That shift is small on paper, massive in practice. If you're listening and wondering when you last felt seen, pay attention to your body as you think about it. Tight? Heavy? Flat? That's information, not failure. Being seen is a human need, not a luxury. When it's missing, everything suffers. Relationships, motivation, learning, even language. And when it returns quietly, without ceremony, life regains color. That night wasn't the end of our struggle, but it was the return of something essential. Presence. And once presence comes back, healing becomes possible, step by simple step. What science says about being seen. Being seen feels emotional, almost poetic, but it's actually biological. Your brain doesn't care about romance or good intentions. It cares about signals. Safety or threat. Connection or isolation. And when someone truly sees you, your brain responds before you even understand why. Let's make this simple. Your nervous system is constantly asking one question: am I safe here? Not physically safe. Emotionally safe. Safe to exist as you are without editing yourself. When the answer is yes, your brain opens. When the answer is no, or unclear, it tightens. Scientists call this process neuroception. It's your body's ability to detect safety without conscious thought. Tone of voice. Facial expression. Timing. Presence. All of these are read faster than words. That's why someone can say, "I'm listening," and your body still doesn't believe them. Feeling seen happens when neuroception reads safety. Research in interpersonal neuroscience shows that when two people are emotionally attuned, meaning one accurately reflects the other's inner state, their nervous systems begin to synchronize. Heart rates align. Breathing patterns slow. Stress hormones drop. This isn't mystical. It's measurable. That synchronization is why a single conversation can feel more restorative than a full night's sleep. When you're not seen, the opposite happens. Your body stays alert. Muscles stay tense. Attention narrows. Your brain prioritizes self-monitoring over learning. That's why motivation disappears. Curiosity shuts down. New information, like a foreign language, feels intrusive rather than interesting. In learning psychology, this is called affective filter. When emotional stress is high, the filter rises, blocking input from being processed deeply. You can hear the words, but they don't convert into memory or meaning. They bounce off. That was my experience with English. The issue wasn't exposure. It was emotional interference. What changed after that simple date wasn't my study method. It was my nervous system's state. Feeling seen lowered the filter. Suddenly, English sounded clearer, not because it was easier, but because my brain had room again. There's also a concept called mirroring. When someone reflects your feelings back to you accurately, your brain receives confirmation: I exist, and I make sense. This reduces the brain's need to self-validate. energy is freed up. Think about how much mental energy you spend wondering how you're perceived. Now imagine that energy being released. That's what being seen does. Studies in attachment theory show that adults with secure emotional bonds demonstrate higher resilience, better learning capacity, and greater emotional regulation. Not because they're smarter, but because their nervous systems aren't constantly defending. This applies directly to language learning. Speaking requires vulnerability. You risk being misunderstood. You risk sounding foolish. If your emotional system already feels unsafe, it will avoid that risk at all costs. So if you've ever frozen while speaking English, understand this: your brain wasn't failing. It was protecting you. Here's the hopeful part. Safety is contagious. Once your nervous system experiences it, even briefly, it remembers. You can recreate it through intentional environments, gentle practice, slow speech, self-compassion, and yes, supportive relationships. That's why slow, real English practice works better than aggressive drills. It respects the nervous system. It invites rather than demands. And that's also why relationships matter more than we admit. They don't just affect emotions. They shape cognition. Feeling seen is not about being praised or agreed with. It's about being recognized without distortion. When that happens, your brain says, "I can relax now." And relaxed brains learn faster. So if learning feels hard, don't start with vocabulary. Start with safety. Ask yourself where you feel most like yourself, and practice there. Because when you're seen, your brain opens. And when your brain opens, growth becomes natural again. How love quietly comes back. Love doesn't return with fireworks. It tiptoes. It tests the floor before stepping in. After that evening, nothing in our life looked dramatically different. Same house. Same schedule. Same kids asking the same questions at the same volume. But the emotional temperature shifted, just enough to notice. That's how love comes back. Not as a feeling first, but as a behavior. We started with small adjustments that looked insignificant from the outside. A longer pause before responding. A question asked without rushing to the next task. A message sent during the day that didn't require action, just presence. These weren't romantic gestures. They were signals. Signals tell the nervous system, you matter again. Relationship research shows that connection is rebuilt through micro-moments, brief, consistent interactions of attunement. Not grand apologies. Not long conversations every night. Just repeated proof that attention still exists. Love grows where attention is sustained. I noticed how these moments softened everything else. When my partner spoke, I listened without planning my reply. When I spoke, I felt less pressure to be impressive or efficient. We weren't fixing the relationship. We were inhabiting it again. And here's the surprising part. Effort decreased as connection increased. When love is strained, everything feels heavy. You overthink tone. You rehearse words. You brace yourself. But when safety returns, even slightly, effort drops. You don't have to perform closeness. You just show up. This mirrors what happens in learning. When English practice feels forced, progress slows. When it feels safe, progress sneaks up on you. After that shift at home, I found myself speaking English out loud without planning to, commenting on small things, repeating phrases naturally, not because I was disciplined, but because I wasn't tense. Love came back the same way, quietly, without announcements. There's a psychological principle called behavioral activation. It suggests that action precedes emotion. You don't wait to feel motivated, you act, and motivation follows. That applies to relationships too. You don't wait to feel in love. You act with care, and love reappears in response. We didn't talk about us every day. We didn't schedule heavy conversations. We prioritized something simpler, being reachable. Emotionally reachable. That meant phones down sometimes. Eye contact. Letting silence exist without filling it. Those choices accumulate. Over time, laughter returned, not forced, not nostalgic but present. The kind of laughter that surprises you because it feels unplanned. That's often the sign that love is breathing again. I also noticed a shift in how conflict felt. Disagreements didn't vanish, but they didn't escalate as quickly. When you feel seen, you don't need to prove your pain. You trust it will be noticed. This trust is foundational. Attachment studies show that secure connection doesn't eliminate conflict. It changes how conflict is interpreted. From threat to information. From danger to dialogue. Love didn't come back as certainty. It came back as curiosity. About each other. About ourselves. About what we could still become together. And curiosity is powerful. It pulls you forward without pressure. It invites exploration. It turns routine into discovery. If you're listening and hoping for a dramatic turnaround, I want to offer a gentler truth. Love often returns quietly because it never left completely. It just waited for attention. The same is true for your voice. For your ability to learn. For your desire to grow. They're not gone. They're dormant. When you create safety, through small actions, consistent presence, and self-kindness, things wake up. Love doesn't need to be chased. It needs to be noticed. And once you notice it again, you realize it's been walking beside you the whole time, waiting for you to look back. Learning English like rebuilding trust. Trust doesn't return all at once. It rebuilds the way muscles do, through small, repeated movements that don't hurt too much. Learning English is exactly like that. If you try to lift too heavy, too fast, your brain resists. But if you move gently, consistently, something unexpected happens. Strength grows quietly. After our connection began to heal, I noticed how my approach to English changed without a formal decision. I stopped trying to sound advanced. I stopped measuring progress in pages or minutes. Instead, I focused on something simpler, staying present long enough to finish a thought. That's how trust works too. You don't promise forever. You show up today. In psychology, this is called graded exposure. When your nervous system associates an activity with safety, it allows you to do a little more each time. In relationships, that means sharing one honest feeling. In language learning, that means speaking one imperfect sentence without self-attack. Before, every mistake felt dangerous, like evidence. Now, mistakes felt informational, just data. That shift alone changed everything. I started reading English out loud slowly, not to sound fluent, but to hear myself. Hearing your own voice matters. It anchors you. Research in language acquisition shows that auditory feedback, listening to yourself speak, strengthens neural pathways more effectively than silent study. But only when anxiety is low. Anxious brains rush. Safe brains explore. I practiced English the same way we practiced reconnection at home. Short sessions. Low stakes. Real context. Sometimes I'd read a paragraph that matched my emotional state. Words about feeling tired, hopeful, unsure. Language sticks better when it mirrors your inner world. That's not coincidence. Memory is emotional. Your brain remembers what it feels. Rebuilding trust in a relationship requires predictability. So does learning. When your brain knows what to expect, same time, same pace, same kindness, it stops bracing. Progress becomes a side effect. I also allowed silence. In conversation and in practice. Silence isn't failure. It's processing. When you don't rush to fill it, understanding deepens. Here's something most people get wrong about motivation. They think it's a starting point. It's not. It's a result. Motivation appears after safety, not before it. That's why forcing yourself rarely works long-term. Trust grows where pressure doesn't live. Over time, my English started to sound more natural. Not because I memorized more, but because I hesitated less. Hesitation kills flow. Safety restores it. The parallel was impossible to ignore. Just as trust returned through consistency at home, confidence returned through gentleness in learning. No dramatic breakthroughs. Just steady movement forward. If you're rebuilding your marriage, your motivation, your English, remember this: progress doesn't need intensity. It needs reliability. Ask yourself, what's the smallest version of this I can do without resistance? Then do that. Tomorrow, do it again. Trust doesn't care about speed. It cares about honesty. When you respect your nervous system, it rewards you with access to your voice, your curiosity, your capacity to grow. English is not a test of intelligence. It's a relationship. With sound. With meaning. With yourself. And like any relationship, it thrives when you stop forcing and start listening. When did you last feel seen? Let me ask you something. Slowly, honestly. When was the last time you felt truly seen? Not praised, not approved of, just recognized as you are, where you are, without needing to perform. Most people pause here. That pause is important, because being unseen doesn't always hurt sharply. Sometimes it dulls you. It flattens color. Days blur. Motivation fades. You don't quit, you drift. In relationships. In learning. In yourself. That's where many of us are right now. We're functioning. Showing up. Getting through. But something essential feels postponed, like it's waiting for permission to return. And often, that permission comes from one simple experience: being seen. Psychology tells us that identity is reinforced through reflection. We understand who we are by how others respond to us. When no one reflects us back, we start to disappear, not physically but internally. Confidence shrinks. Curiosity fades. Expression quiets. That's why this story matters. Not because of the date. Not because of English. But because of the question underneath it all: do I still matter here? When the answer becomes yes, even briefly, everything shifts. I didn't suddenly become a better partner or a more fluent English speaker overnight. What changed was something deeper. I stopped doubting my presence. I stopped apologizing for taking up space. And when that happened, my voice returned, naturally. Language is not just communication. It's visibility. Speaking is a way of saying, I'm here. If you're struggling with English, ask yourself gently, where in your life do you feel unseen? Because learning doesn't happen in isolation. It happens inside a nervous system shaped by connection. And here's the hopeful part: you don't need someone else to start this process. You can begin by seeing yourself. By slowing down. By practicing without punishment. By choosing environments, people, content, routines that feel emotionally safe. Small actions matter. A short walk with someone you trust. A quiet conversation without phones. Reading a sentence out loud and letting it land. These moments rebuild visibility. And if you're in a relationship that feels distant, remember this: reconnection doesn't require fixing everything. It requires one moment of presence. One question asked sincerely. One pause where you listen instead of preparing your reply. That's how love comes back. That's how motivation returns. That's how learning becomes possible again. So I'll leave you with the same question that changed everything for me, not as pressure, but as an invitation. When did you last feel seen? And what's one small thing you could do this week to create that feeling again, for yourself or for someone you love? Because when you feel seen, you don't just survive. You speak. You connect. You grow. Sometimes, the hardest part of learning English is not the language. It's the quiet moment when you realize you've stopped listening to yourself. This story wasn't just about love, or marriage, or one simple date. It was about something deeper. The moment a person feels seen again, and suddenly, words come back to life. If you're still here, listening to the last seconds of this video, that means a part of you is still awake, still hoping, still trying, even when you feel tired. And maybe your English didn't stop improving. Maybe it was just waiting for you to feel safe enough to speak again. On this channel, we don't rush English. We don't shout motivation. We don't pretend life is easy. We practice real English through real stories about love, family, failure, healing, and the small moments that quietly change everything. If this story felt like it was speaking for you, save it. Share it with someone who needs to feel seen. And subscribe to the channel, because the next story might sound even more familiar than this one. And sometimes, one story is all it takes to start speaking again. Subscribe now for more slow English listening, reading, speaking through real-life emotional stories. New videos every week. Learn English without losing yourself. You're not late. You're right on time.